Everyone saw an old man collapse in the snow, too weak to defend himself when the biker's punch slammed him to the ground. Yet no one stepped in. In that moment, he looked small, forgotten, like a life the world had stopped caring about. But when his sleeve slipped down and revealed a faded Special Forces tattoo worn thin by time, something inside Jim Walker broke. Because that kind of pain doesn't come from age. It comes from sacrifice only warriors carry. And as Jim and his dog Rex pushed through the storm toward him, one truth became undeniable. The biker had just laid hands on a man who once fought so others could live. And this time, he wouldn't stand alone. Frostwood. Alaska was the kind of place where winter didn't visit. It stayed. 9 months of the year, the town lived under a blanket of white that never truly melted, clinging to rooftops, burying porches, and swallowing the narrow main road that wound between wooden buildings built decades ago. The morning sky was a dim gray blue, muted by a swirling curtain of snow carried by winds sharp enough to sting through thick coats. Timberline Grill, a small diner with fogged windows, and a flickering neon sign, glowed like a lifeboat in the storm. Inside, warmth, coffee, and the smell of bacon offered refuge to anyone brave enough to step in from the bitter cold. Today, Jim Walker and his dog Rex occupied their usual booth. Jim Walker, 50 years old, and built like a man carved from stubborn mountain rock, sat with his back to the wall as he always did. His short, military-style gray hair framed a weathered face that bore faint scars, stories he never told. He wore a military cold-weather parka, its faded olive fabric and high collar showing years of use in harsh environments. Jim was a quiet man, the kind who observed before speaking, whose deep-set eyes scanned a room with the discipline of someone who had spent too long in places where danger hid in plain sight. Beside him, Rex rested calmly, though nothing about the dog was ever truly relaxed. Rex, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick winter coat and intelligent amber eyes, lay under the table with his head between his paws. Even at rest, the dog radiated alertness, ears twitching at every creak of the diner's door or gust of wind outside. His fur caught flecks of snow each time they entered, melting into tiny droplets along his back. Rex had served alongside Jim for years, search and rescue missions, survival exercises, and moments neither man nor dog forgot. The pair were inseparable now, two veterans sharing a quiet life far from battlefields, but never fully detached from the instincts forged there. Timberline Grill itself was a gathering place for Frostwood's residents. The walls were lined with photographs of logging crews, blizzard rescues, and fishermen proudly holding catches nearly as large as the boats they came from. Jenna, the young waitress with a soft voice and warm eyes, moved between tables carrying steaming plates. She was slender, with auburn hair braided down her back and freckles dusting her pale skin. Alaska's sun and wind left their marks on everyone. She liked Jim and Rex, always leaving a small piece of bacon at the corner of the plate for the dog. Jim pretended not to notice, but Rex never missed it. Outside, the cold bit deeper. Frank Dalton, the elderly man who handled most of the diner's early morning chores, was sweeping snow from the entrance despite the futility of the task. At 70, Frank was thin and wiry, his posture slightly hunched from years of hard work. His face was long and lined, framed by white hair kept short under a knit cap. His hands, narrow and bony, trembled slightly from age and cold, yet he worked with a patient, almost methodical rhythm. Frank rarely spoke unless spoken to. When he did, his voice carried a gentle rasp, like someone who had lived through more winters than he cared to count. Most assumed he'd spent his life in quiet obscurity. With every sweep of the broom, snowflakes clung to Frank's worn jacket, a tan canvas coat frayed at the sleeves. His breath fogged the air in thick clouds as he cleared the steps leading to the diner's door. Drivers passing through Frostwood barely noticed the old man. Locals respected him, but kept their distance, sensing something private and untold behind his solemn eyes. Frank never joined conversations about hunting, sports, or weather. He simply worked, opening the diner before dawn, sweeping snow, stacking wood, and wiping frost from the windows. He moved with a certain precision that didn't quite match his frail frame. Jim watched Frank through the window between sips of black coffee. There was something about the old man that always drew Jim's attention. It wasn't pity. Jim despised that emotion. But recognition. Frank carried himself like someone accustomed to hardship, someone who had once lived with purpose and intensity, but now chose anonymity. Jim noticed the small details others overlooked. The way Frank scanned the street before stepping outside, the way his eyes narrowed at sudden noises, the subtle tension in his shoulders, even in the cold. These were not the habits of a simple dishwasher. They were remnants of training that stayed with a man long after uniforms were gone. Rex noticed, too. The dog's amber eyes often followed Frank, tail thumping once in acknowledgement whenever the old man opened the door. Animals recognized certain things humans ignored: fear, courage, brokenness. Each time Frank approached their booth, Rex would sit up straighter, ears perked, as if saluting a fellow warrior whose scent carried old smoke and metal. Frank always chuckled softly, scratching Rex behind the ear before moving on. "Good boy," he would murmur, though his voice often held a sadness deeper than the words themselves. Jim sensed it, but respected Frank's silence. Inside the diner, the morning ambiance was interrupted only by the wind rattling the windows and the occasional gust of snow slipping through the door when customers entered. Jenna refilled Jim's coffee, offering a tired smile. "Storm's getting worse," she said. "Frank's out there freezing." Jim nodded, though his gaze remained fixed on the old man outside. Something about Frank's movements today seemed slower, heavier, as if the cold was pushing deeper than usual. Jim debated stepping out to help, but knew Frank's pride. Some burdens couldn't be lifted until the person carrying them allowed it. Then, as Frank bent to clear another pile of snow from the corner of the wooden steps, a sudden, strong gust of wind blew, his sleeve upward. For the briefest second, something dark peeked from beneath the fabric along his wrist. An old tattoo, faded by time and scars. Jim's eyes narrowed. It wasn't the kind of tattoo a normal man carried. It was military. Distinctive lines, partial insignia, the kind worn only by soldiers from units that didn't speak of their missions. Rex's ears shot up instantly, sensing his owner's shift in focus. Jim leaned forward, studying Frank more carefully than ever. Something was about to change in Frostwood, something brewing silently beneath the snow. The quiet morning calm of Frostwood shattered when the rumble of motorcycles tore through the icy air like rolling thunder. The sound echoed between snow-covered rooftops, vibrating through the wooden walls of Timberline Grill and drawing startled glances from the early diners. Outside, the blizzard haze parted just enough to reveal the silhouettes of riders cutting through the storm. Large figures wrapped in leather, headlights slicing through sheets of falling snow. The lead bike, a matte black cruiser with steel fangs welded onto the front frame, signaled trouble long before its rider became clearly visible. Frostwood rarely saw outsiders in winter. Outsiders arriving in a pack was even worse. Mason Briggs led the group like a wolf claiming new territory. 40 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, he carried the presence of someone used to hurting others without hesitation. His square jaw was covered in a thick, dark beard streaked with frost, and a long scar ran from his left eyebrow down to his cheek, twisting whenever he smirked. His eyes were a cold, pale gray, flat, unreadable, and always searching for weakness. Mason wore a sleeveless leather biker vest despite the brutal cold, the emblem of the Steel Viper's MC emblazoned across the back, a coiled serpent wrapped around a piston. His bare arms were covered in dense tattoos, skulls, flames, snakes, ink that crawled across old knife scars like a map of violence. Behind Mason, 4 other riders rolled into town. The first was Ripper Tate, a hulking man in his mid-30s with a buzz-cut head, a broken nose, and a jaw that looked carved from concrete. His thick neck and massive forearms made him resemble a human bulldozer, and he had a reputation for settling arguments with headbutts rather than words. Beside him rode Jax Needles Moreno, the gang's wiry mechanic with narrow eyes and a jittery demeanor, constantly twitching as though wired on caffeine and cold adrenaline. His long black hair whipped in the wind, revealing multiple piercings that climbed along both ears. Needles spoke fast, moved fast, and picked fights even faster. 2 younger members brought up the rear: Cody Briggs, Mason's 19-year-old nephew, and Trent Spade Holloway, an impulsive hothead known for lying about everything from bar fights to girlfriends. Cody was tall, lean, and pale, with soft features that didn't match the leather he wore. He seemed uneasy on his bike, more frightened follower than outlaw. Trent, by contrast, wore a cocky grin, his messy blonde hair sticking out from beneath his helmet like wild straw. They followed Mason not out of loyalty, but out of fear, clinging to his shadow because it was the only place they felt untouchable. As the gang slowed to a stop in front of Timberline Grill, snow churned around them in swirling spirals, blown by the force of their arrival. Mason killed his engine with a flick of his wrist, the sudden silence almost as unsettling as the roar that came before. He scanned the small town square, just a handful of buildings, a snow-buried road, and the diner glowing warmly through frosted windows. "Quiet little place," Mason muttered, breath fogging the air. "Perfect." The other riders exchanged grins, already smelling weakness, already eager for the thrill of dominating a town too small and too peaceful to resist them. Meanwhile, inside the diner, Jim Walker raised his eyes at the sound. Jim noticed the shift in atmosphere before anyone else. Something primal in him, instinct sharpened by deployments and dark memories, reacted to the sudden intrusion of engines. He sat taller, shoulders tense beneath his military cold-weather parka, watching frost swirl past the window as the biker silhouettes grew clearer. Rex sensed it too. The German shepherd rose to his feet, head lifting, ears angled forward, muscles tightening beneath his thick winter coat. A low, quiet rumble vibrated in the dog's throat. Not aggression, but readiness. A soldier recognizing the approach of possible threat. Jim placed a calm hand on Rex's back, not to soothe him, but to acknowledge they felt the same thing. Frank Dalton was still outside when the gang arrived. The old man had just finished clearing the steps and was adjusting his gloves when he froze mid-movement. His lined face tightened as he watched the bikes roll to a stop, his posture becoming rigid, too rigid for someone supposedly frail. For a moment, his eyes flicked over each rider with precise, practiced assessment, the kind a trained operative might use. Mason's gaze swept the street and landed on Frank. Their eyes locked for a brief second, old soldier and violent outlaw taking each other's measure through a drifting veil of snow. Frank's jaw clenched. Mason's lips curled into a cruel, interested grin. The bikers dismounted one by one, boots crunching over frozen ground. Ripper smacked his gloves together and cracked his knuckles, fog rising from his breath like smoke. Needles kicked snow off his boots and spat onto the ground, muttering something under his breath as he caught sight of Frank. Cody lingered behind the others, visibly uncomfortable in the cold, while Trent strutted forward with his chest puffed like a rooster. Mason stepped directly toward Frank, boots leaving heavy prints in the snow. "Mornin', old man," he growled, voice low and mocking. "Nice town you got here. Shame if someone shook it up." Frank's reaction was subtle but sharp. Instead of cowering, he straightened, a movement almost imperceptible, but enough for Jim, watching from inside, to notice. The wind tugged at Frank's sleeve again, revealing the faint outline of the same tattoo Jim had glimpsed earlier. This time Jim saw more. The edge of an eagle's wing, a faded number sequence, scar tissue twisted around ink. Recognition hit him hard. That wasn't just a military tattoo. That was a special forces mark, one only carried by operatives who had seen deep combat, high-risk operations, and classified missions. Something about the old man's past aligned with the sudden danger appearing before him. Jenna, unaware of the tension gathering outside, approached Jim's table and set a steaming plate in front of him. "Breakfast?" she asked softly, but her eyes followed Jim's to the window. Her expression faltered as she took in the sight of the bikers forming a semicircle around Frank. "Oh no, not today. Poor Frank." Her knuckles whitened around the coffee pot. Jim's jaw settled into a hard line. Rex stood beside him now, tail stiff, eyes locked on Frank like he was part of Jim's old team again. Inside the diner, silence thickened. Outside, the first confrontation of the day was seconds from erupting. When Mason closed the distance between them, Frank took a step back, not in fear, but in measured restraint. He placed one hand on the snow shovel as if using it for balance, though the deliberate angle of his grip said otherwise. Mason noticed and smirked. "Relax, Gramps. We're just passing through," he said, though his tone promised anything but peace. Ripper and Trent circled to Frank's sides like wolves tightening a trap. Needles kicked at Frank's broom, sending it skidding across the snow. Frank's nostrils flared. Jim rose from his seat instantly. Rex moved with him, paws silent on the floor despite his size. Trouble had officially arrived in Frostwood. The storm intensified around Timberline Grill, the wind howling as if it wanted to tear the small wooden building from its foundation. Snow lashed against the windows, causing them to rattle in their frames, blurring the figures outside. Frank Dalton stood on the wooden steps, bracing himself against the gale while Mason Briggs and his gang tightened their semicircle. The snow beneath Frank's boots had already turned into a slushy depression from his earlier sweeping. Mason towered in front of him, his leather vest dusted with fresh flakes, his pale gray eyes gleaming with sadistic interest. The biker leader's posture was loose and predatory, like a man who enjoyed the promise of dominance more than the act itself. Mason took a slow step closer to Frank, his heavy boots crunching loudly against the ice. "Look at you," he mocked, his voice carrying over the howling wind. 70 years old and still trying to play useful. Must be hard, dragging that old, brittle body around. His breath fogged the air in icy plumes. Frank's jaw tightened, deep grooves forming along his aging face. The old man didn't flinch or step back, but there was a flicker in his eyes, an old instinct sharpening, a habit he had tried to bury. Behind Mason, Ripper and Trent exchanged eager looks. They were like hyenas waiting for their alpha to strike first, hungry for the cruelty that would follow. Ripper Tate stepped forward, his enormous frame blocking part of the storm, making Frank look even smaller in comparison. "Want me to move him, Mason?" he asked, flexing his thick fingers, each one scarred from fights long past. Mason smirked and lifted a hand lazily. "Not yet. I want to see how much this relic can take." Jacks, needles. Moreno hopped from one foot to the other, shaking from cold and nerves, but unable to hide the twisted grin spreading across his face. Cody Briggs hung back, hands shoved into his pockets, looking deeply uncomfortable as he watched the scene unfolding. He wasn't made for violence, at least not yet. But fear of his uncle kept him silent. Frank inhaled deeply, the cold air burning his lungs. He straightened his back, a reflexive act that briefly revealed the veteran he once was, before life buried him beneath layers of quiet labor and anonymity. Mason's smile widened as he noticed it. "There it is," he taunted. "A little spark. You must have been somebody once." He leaned in, almost nose to nose with Frank. "But you're nobody now." Then, with sudden force, Mason shoved Frank hard in the chest. The impact sent the old man stumbling backward onto the snow-covered ground. The fall was rough, knocking the air out of him, his arms flailing slightly before he hit the ice-packed pavement. The shove exposed more than just Frank's vulnerability. As he hit the ground, the sleeve of his canvas jacket pushed up, revealing a larger portion of the faded tattoo Jim had glimpsed before. The inked eagle's head was clearer now, scar tissue wrapping around it like barbed wire frozen under Frank's skin. Cody's eyes widened when he saw it. Needles let out a low whistle. Ripper raised an eyebrow, but Mason only smirked deeper. Well, Grandpa's got himself a tattoo," he drawled. "What did you get that for? Trying to impress ladies in the 60s? He didn't recognize the mark, but Jim did. Jim Walker pushed back from his booth the moment Frank hit the ground. The chair legs screeched across the wooden floor, drawing startled looks from Jenna and the few customers who remained in the storm. Jim's expression hardened into something carved from stone. Every instinct he'd ever trained to respond to threat surged to full alert. Rex moved before Jim even stepped forward. The German Shepherd was already at the door, rigid and tense, the fur along his spine raised in a perfect ridge. Jim strode toward the exit, parka swaying with each purposeful step, his deep-set eyes locked onto the bikers through the frost-laced windows. Jenna rushed after him, her braid swinging behind her as she tried to catch his arm. "Jim, don't!" she pleaded, her voice breaking with panic. "They're dangerous." She wasn't wrong. Standing barely 5'6", Jenna looked even smaller next to Jim's broad frame. Her freckles seemed to stand out more sharply against her pale skin, flushed with worry. But Jim didn't slow. He gently but firmly moved her aside with a steady hand placed on her shoulder. "Stay inside," he said quietly. "Lock the door if it gets bad." Jenna hesitated, looking at Rex, whose amber eyes burned with intent, then backed away, hugging herself as fear rattled her breath. Outside, Mason leaned over Frank, one boot pressing dangerously close to the old man's ribs. "Get up," he ordered coldly. "I'm not done humiliating you." Frank's gloved hands pressed into the snow as he tried to push himself up, but the cold and the fall made it difficult. Mason nudged him roughly with his boot. "Move, old man." The cruelty of the moment spiked something in Cody Briggs. The teenager took a step forward, his eyes darting between Frank and his uncle. "Uncle Mason, maybe we should just leave him alone. He's really old." Mason turned, glaring at Cody with an expression sharp enough to cut steel. "You trying to question me?" Cody immediately shrank back. Jim stepped outside just as Mason raised his foot again. Wind slammed into him, whipping his parka and blasting ice crystals across his face. Rex padded out at his side, moving with the precision of a trained soldier. Mason paused mid-motion, glancing their way. His smirk returned, but his eyes narrowed at the sight of Jim, his posture, his build, the calm in his expression. Ripper snorted. "Look at that! Town hero's coming to save the day." Trent laughed, though it came out shaky, like he didn't quite believe the words himself. Jim didn't, Speak." He walked until he stood just a few feet from Mason, his boots planting firmly in the snow like roots anchoring into frozen earth. Rex positioned himself slightly ahead of Jim, not attacking, but blocking anyone from getting closer to his handler. The dog's ears were forward, body stiff, breath visible in short bursts. Mason chuckled and shook his head. "Look at this. Grandpa's got a bodyguard." He tilted his head, inspecting Jim more closely. "And who are you supposed to be? Another old-timer who thinks he can still fight?" Jim didn't answer. His eyes drifted to Frank, who was struggling to sit up. Then his gaze returned to the tattoo on Frank's wrist, now revealed fully in the swirling snow. The mark was unmistakable. Special Forces, the kind of unit that didn't advertise their existence. Jim spoke at last, his voice low and steady. "You should step back." Mason blinked, then burst into mocking laughter. Ripper joined in, Needles cackled, and Trent let out a high-pitched laugh that was more nerves than humor. "Or what?" Mason sneered. Jim didn't blink. "You don't know who you're pushing around," he said. "But I do." His gaze dropped once more to Frank's tattoo. Then he looked Mason in the eyes. "And if you touch him again, you'll regret it." The wind roared between them, carrying ice shards like warnings from the storm itself. Mason's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of something primal. Recognition of the kind of confidence that meant trouble. The moment Frank Dalton's sleeve rode up, time seemed to slow for Jim Walker. The old man lay half-curled in the snow, his breath coming out in ragged white bursts, the thin work jacket no match for the brutal Alaska wind. On his forearm, half hidden beneath age spots and faint scars, the ink emerged. Airborne wings, a dagger, and the faded words, "Special Forces, Long-Range Recon, Laos 71. Snowflakes clung to the lines like ash. Jim's chest tightened. This wasn't some barroom tattoo. This was a ghost from a war most people had forgotten, carved into the skin of the quiet janitor everyone thought they knew. Rex moved first. The German shepherd's body stiffened, muscles coiling as he stepped forward, a low growl rumbling in his chest. His sharp brown eyes flicked from Mason Briggs to Frank, then back to the crowd pressed against the restaurant windows. The bike engines still idled nearby, coughing exhaust into the frozen air. A neon "open" sign buzzed faintly above the Timberline grill door, its red light flickering on the snow like distant emergency flares. Jim felt the old, cold part of himself wake up, the part that catalogued threats, angles, exits, and distances before his conscious mind even caught up. Mason didn't notice the tattoo at first. He stood over Frank, shoulders squared in his heavy leather jacket, patches of the Steel Viper's MC sewn across his broad back. His beard was thick and dark, flecked with frost, and his pale eyes gleamed with the cruel amusement of a predator that had never truly been challenged. "Can't handle a little nudge, old man?" he sneered, spreading his arms as if inviting applause. One of his bikers laughed nervously, boots crunching on the ice. But the people watching from inside the diner were silent, faces pale and drawn. This wasn't entertainment to them. It was a line being crossed. Jim's gaze stayed locked on Frank's arm. The letters Laos 71 were faint but unmistakable, like a whisper from a jungle half a world away. Jim had never served there. Different war, different decade. But he'd heard stories from older soldiers in smoky barracks, tales told late at night when sleep wouldn't come. Long-range recon teams dropped deep behind enemy lines, abandoned on maps, forgotten in official briefings. Men with those tattoos had seen things no one admitted had ever happened. Jim knelt slightly, his breath misting, trying to see more without drawing attention. Rex stepped closer to Frank, sniffing the air, then looked up at Jim with a questioning whine. Frank tried to pull his sleeve down, hands shaking, but the fabric was bunched around his elbow. His eyes, washed out blue and tired, flicked to Jim briefly. Just a heartbeat of recognition. Then fear. Not fear of Mason. Fear of being recognized for who he used to be. Frank had always moved like a man trying to take up less space than he deserved, shuffling quietly with his broom, nodding politely to customers, never staying in one conversation long. Now, sprawled in the snow, his past was literally exposed to the cold. Jim saw something in his gaze, a plea not to say anything, to let the ink fade back into anonymity. But Mason finally noticed the tattoo. He squinted down, then laughed, the sound sharp and ugly. "What's this?" he said, crouching slightly and grabbing Frank's wrist, yanking his arm higher into the air. "Look at Grandpa here, trying to look tough. You think some old war stamp makes you special?" The wind whipped harder around them, flinging snow into Mason's face, but he didn't flinch. Frank hissed in pain, his other hand curling into the snow. "Leave him alone," Jim said, his voice low but carrying. The words weren't loud, but they cut through the rattle of engines and the moan of the wind like a blade. Mason's head turned slowly toward Jim, annoyance flaring. "You talking to me, Parker boy?" he asked, sizing Jim up. The military cold-weather jacket, the squared shoulders, the quiet steadiness in his stance. Rex took another step forward, teeth barely visible behind his lips, the fur along his spine lifting. Jim didn't move closer, but his presence felt heavier, the way a storm front presses down on a valley. "You shoved an old man on ice," Jim said evenly. "That's not toughness, that's cowardice." A murmur rippled through the people behind the glass. For months, maybe years, they had avoided eye contact with the steel vipers, pretending not to see. Now someone had said it out loud. Mason snorted, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes now, wariness mixed with irritation. "This old man was in my way," he replied, "and if he doesn't want people to see whatever's on his arm, he shouldn't be out here pretending he matters." He gave Frank's wrist another rough twist, making him wince. Jim saw Frank's jaw clench, the way his eyes closed briefly, as if bracing not just against pain, but against memories crashing through. Jim remembered men like that from the VA waiting rooms, men who would rather be invisible than be thanked too late, men who carried ghosts under their skin. For a heartbeat, Jim considered walking away. This wasn't his town. Frostwood was just a cold dot on a map he had passed through on his own search for peace. But peace was always tied to what you allowed to happen in front of you. Rex let out another growl, louder this time, and Jim made his choice. He stepped closer, boots grinding on the packed snow, until he stood just a few yards from Mason. The biker straightened, dropping Frank's hand at last. "You got something to say about his tattoo?" Mason challenged. "You recognize it or something, hero?" The way he said hero turned it into an insult. Jim's eyes didn't leave Mason's, but his voice shifted so everyone could hear. "That's not just a tattoo," Jim said. "It's Airborne Special Forces, Long-Range Recon, Laos, 1971. Men with that mark went into places where backup didn't exist. They bled so loudmouths like you could grow up in a country where you're free to be this stupid." A hush fell over the parking lot. Even the bikers seemed thrown for a moment, glancing between the ink and the calm authority in Jim's tone. Inside the diner, faces pressed closer to the glass, breath fogging the windows. Frank stared at Jim, breathing hard, chest rising and falling under his thin jacket. The wind gusted, rattling the sign above them, sending a flurry of snow across the asphalt like white smoke on a battlefield. Mason's jaw worked as he weighed his options. This had stopped being a simple moment of humiliation for an old man. Now it was about him being called out, challenged in front of his crew and the whole town. Jim could see the familiar pattern forming in the biker's mind: back down and lose face, or double down and escalate. Rex stood squarely between Frank and Mason now, head slightly lowered, ready to move in whatever direction Jim chose. Jim bent down briefly, reaching a gloved hand toward Frank. "You all right, sir?" he asked quietly. Frank hesitated, then nodded, though pain etched lines deeper into his weathered face. Up close, Jim noticed the strong bones of his jaw, the high cheekbones, the kind of structure that used to look sharp in a young man's uniform, and now had softened under years of quiet labor. "Didn't want any trouble," Frank whispered. "Just clearing the snow." Jim's throat tightened. "You spent your life clearing a lot more than snow," he said softly, then straightened, turning back toward Mason with a different kind of resolve in his eyes. Mason took a step closer, boots sliding slightly on the ice, either not understanding or not caring about the history stitched into Frank's skin. "You think a story about some ancient war is supposed to scare me?" he scoffed. His breath smelled faintly of cheap whiskey and colder intentions. "Out here, it's not about who you were. It's about who owns the road now." He gestured to his men and the roaring bikes, as if they were proof of his kingdom. Jim didn't flinch. "Then maybe it's time you learned the difference between owning a road and respecting the people who walked it long before you," he replied. For a long, suspended moment, the only sounds were the scraping of the flagpole rope against metal and the distant caw of a raven circling above the frozen roofs. Jim could feel the tipping point approaching, the way he used to feel it in alleys in foreign cities, in dust-choked streets that always smelled like burnt rubber and fear. Either this ended with words, or it didn't. Rex shifted his weight. Ready. Frank, still on one knee, looked from Jim to Mason, confusion, shame, and something like hope flickering across his lined face. The old warrior inside him was being dragged into the light whether he wanted it or not. As another gust of wind tore through the parking lot, snow swirling around them like ghosts of forgotten battles, Jim understood there was no going back to being just another quiet traveler passing through Frostwood. Not after what he had seen inked on Frank's arm. Not after the way Mason laughed at it. The tattoo had changed everything. It had revealed that the town's shy old janitor was more than he seemed, and that the line between bully and defender had just been drawn in the snow. Jim squared his shoulders, his decision made. Whatever came next would not be settled with insults alone. The wind sharpened, as if the storm itself sensed the tension thickening between the two men. Mason Briggs stood tall in his heavy leather jacket, the steel viper's patch glinting under the neon diner sign, frost clinging to his beard. Jim Walker stepped out of the doorway with the quiet precision of a seasoned soldier, his military cold-weather parka dark against the blinding snow. Rex moved in beside him, muscles taut, eyes locked on Mason. The entire town seemed to hold its breath as the blizzard raged around them. Inside the timberline grill, faces pressed to the fogged-up windows, fear, curiosity, and something else stirring beneath. A long-buried need for justice. Jim walked forward, boots crunching on the ice, stopping between Mason and the still-shaken Frank Dalton. Frank struggled to regain his footing, one hand pressed to the icy ground, the other attempting to hide the tattoo exposed on his arm. But it was too late. Jim's voice rose above the wind, steady and resonant. "This man is not just a janitor you can shove around," he said. "Frank Dalton served in Airborne Special Forces, Long-Range Recon, Laos, 1971. He survived missions most men never came home from." A ripple went through the crowd. Mason's smirk faltered for the first time, replaced by the irritation of someone whose narrative had been stolen from him. The storm intensified, snowflakes pelting Mason's face, but he didn't blink. Instead, he took 2 heavy steps forward, boots scraping the ice with aggressive intent. "You think I care about some ancient war story?" he shouted, chest heaving. "He's nothing now." Rex growled, the sound low and dangerous, causing a few bikers to shift uneasily. Jim didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on Mason, the battlefield calm returning to him with chilling clarity. "Respect is earned," Jim said, "and so is shame. You earned yours tonight." The wind howled as if echoing the accusation. Mason's jaw clenched, and his knuckles whitened beneath his leather gloves. Mason lunged without warning. He moved fast for a man of his size, years of street fights and barroom dominance fueling the raw force behind his charge. But Jim had predicted the angle the moment Mason's foot shifted. In one swift motion, Jim sidestepped, grabbed Mason's jacket near the shoulder, and redirected his momentum into the snow. Mason slammed into the ground with a muffled thud, snow exploding around him. The crowd gasped, and Rex barked sharply, circling to ensure no other biker intervened. Mason scrambled, trying to regain footing, fury twisting his features. But Jim didn't attack. He simply stood his ground like a wall the storm itself couldn't move. Mason roared and rushed again, this time swinging a wide punch aimed at Jim's jaw. Jim ducked beneath it, caught Mason's forearm with a practiced grip, and used the force to pivot the man's arm behind his back. Mason let out a sharp cry as his knees hit the snow once more. Jim pinned him with controlled strength, not enough to injure permanently, but enough to strip away every ounce of false bravado. The storm swirled around them, light glinting off flakes like shards of ice. "You don't get to bully a veteran," Jim said quietly, voice close to Mason's ear. "Not now. Not ever." Mason struggled, breath ragged, but couldn't break free. Frank watched with wide, conflicted eyes. His lined face softened with something between awe and guilt. For years he had lived quietly, sweeping floors instead of wielding rifles, trying to bury a past that once weighed as heavily as the snow now falling on him. Jim looked back and offered a nod. Subtle, respectful, the kind a soldier gives another soldier. The look alone told Frank. "You are not invisible anymore." The townspeople in the diner seemed to recognize it too. The fear that had accompanied the Steel Vipers for months cracked, replaced by murmurs of support. A young waitress pressed her palms against the window, whispering, "Is he really a Special Forces veteran?" Mason thrashed again, kicking up snow, but Jim shifted just enough to hold him down without injury. A biker named Cole Hargrove, tall, wiry, early 20s, with messy blonde hair sticking out beneath his beanie, took a hesitant step forward. Cole's facial hair was patchy, his eyes nervous and uncertain, lacking the cruelty of Mason. He looked between his leader and Jim, swallowed hard, and stepped back again. His reluctance spoke volumes. This wasn't a hardened crew of killers, just young men who had followed a loud voice too long. The townspeople took note, seeing fear in the Steel Vipers for the first time. Snow hammered down, coating Mason's jacket as he snarled, "Let me up, old man!" Jim leaned slightly, applying controlled pressure until Mason winced. "You had your chance to walk away," Jim replied, "but you raised your hand against an innocent man. That ends here." Rex stood by Frank now, vigilant and protective. Frank's breath formed clouds as he slowly stood, hand clutching his ribs, but his posture straightened. Not the slouch of a tired janitor, but the stance of a soldier rediscovering his spine. His voice trembled when he said, "Son, you didn't have to step in." Jim shook his head. "We always step in," he answered softly. The moment stretched, fragile as thin ice. Mason's resistance finally faltered as the cold seeped through his pride. Jim released him, but stayed ready, feet firm in the snow. Mason staggered backward, humiliated and breathing heavily. His bikers watched silently, unsure whether to support him or distance themselves. Mason looked at Frank, hatred burning through the shame in his eyes. But when Mason shifted as if preparing another attack, Rex erupted in a thunderous bark, teeth bared, body lowered into a defensive stance. Mason froze. Even he understood that the dog meant business. More importantly, he understood Jim wasn't alone. A final gust of wind blasted through the parking lot, as though nature itself decided to punctuate the moment. Mason spat onto the snow, the gesture carrying more defeat than defiance now. "This isn't over," he growled, voice cracking under the weight of his embarrassment. "People like you always think you're the heroes." Jim held his stare. "Heroes don't shove old men on ice," he said. "Cowards do." The crowd behind the glass reacted, some gasping, others nodding, a few even clapping softly. Mason's face reddened beneath the frost, and for the first time, he looked smaller than the storm around him. Mason stumbled toward his motorcycle, boots sliding clumsily. His crew followed, though several exchanged uneasy glances with the townspeople watching them. Cole lingered the longest, eyes drifting to Frank's tattoo, then to Jim. Something changed in him. Uncertainty, guilt, maybe even the spark of conscience. Without a word, he climbed onto his bike and started the engine. One by one, the motorcycles roared to life, their thunder swallowed quickly by the storm. Mason revved his engine angrily, glared at Jim one last time, and tore out of the parking lot, snow spraying behind his tires like dust from a retreat. Silence settled after the bikes disappeared, broken only by the howl of the wind. Jim walked back to Frank, offering an arm to help him stand fully. Frank hesitated, pride warring with pain, then accepted. Rex pressed gently against his leg, warming him through the cold. Jim studied Frank's face, the deep wrinkles, the faded scars, the tired but unbroken spirit. "You're safe now," Jim said. Frank nodded slowly, voice hoarse. "Didn't expect to ever hear that again." Jim glanced into the storm where Mason vanished. "Some battles find us whether we want them or not." Frank exhaled, the breath mixing with falling snow like the ghosts of old memories rising. Inside Timberline Grill, someone finally opened the door. Warm light spilled across the snow, inviting and hopeful. The crowd parted as Jim guided Frank inside, Rex following close. For the first time in years, Frank didn't walk through the diner as a silent nobody. People straightened, stepped forward, murmured respect. He wasn't just the old man sweeping snow anymore. Tonight, he was seen. Tonight, the storm had revealed the truth, and Jim Walker had ensured it would not be ignored. Mason Briggs sped across the icy parking lot, snow spraying beneath his tires as he fumbled to start his motorcycle. His breath came out harsh and ragged, mixing with the engine's angry growl. His leather jacket was coated in frost, and humiliation clung to him like a second skin. The rest of the Steel Vipers stood frozen, their uncertainty showing plainly in their eyes. Cole Hargrove, thin frame, blonde hair disheveled beneath his beanie, watched Mason with a conflicted expression, as if slowly realizing he had chosen the wrong man to follow. Mason revved the engine once more, casting a furious glare at Jim Walker before disappearing into the wall of swirling white. Jim stood motionless for a moment, his military cold-weather parka stiff in the wind, snow collecting on the high collar. Rex stayed close at his side, tail stiff, ears alert, watching the bikes vanish into the storm. The sudden silence after the engines faded, made the world feel heavier. Jim turned back toward Frank Dalton, who remained partially hunched, one hand gripping the wall of the diner for stability. The old man's breath fogged in the frigid air, his thin jacket offering almost no protection at all. Jim stepped closer, placing a supportive hand beneath Frank's elbow. "Let's get you inside," Jim said softly. Frank nodded, the lines on his face deepened by pain, cold, and years of carrying a story no one knew. The door of the timberline grill swung open with a long creak, releasing a rush of warm air into the bitter cold outside. A woman in her mid-30s, tall and slender, with wavy, dark brown hair tucked into a knit cap, stepped out. Her name was Linda Merrow, the diner's manager. She had sharp cheekbones, warm, olive-toned skin, and eyes that were usually firm with responsibility. But tonight they were wide with concern. "Frank, dear God," she whispered, hurrying through the snow. Linda reached for Frank's other arm, steadying him with surprising strength. Her voice quivered. "How long have you been hiding all this from us?" Frank tried to smile, but only managed a weak grimace. "Just doing my job," he murmured. Inside the diner, townspeople gathered near the entrance, their faces a mixture of shock and guilt. The timberline grill, usually filled with laughter and clattering plates, had fallen into an uneasy quiet. A bearded man with deep-set eyes, Howard Briggs, the local mechanic, early 50s, stepped forward. His heavy flannel jacket was dusted with snow, and his brows were furrowed. "Frank, all these years you never said a word." Frank looked down, as if embarrassed by the attention. Jim guided him toward the nearest booth, Rex following closely behind. When Frank sat, hands trembling, Jim pulled a blanket from the rack and draped it over his shoulders. The warmth of the diner began thawing the stiffness from Frank's fingers. Linda returned with a mug of hot coffee, steam rising gently. She placed it in Frank's shaking hands, steadying the cup with her own. The townspeople slowly formed a half-circle around the booth, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. Finally, Howard Briggs cleared his throat. "Is it true?" he asked, voice rough but respectful. "Were you really Special Forces?" Frank looked up, his pale blue eyes clouded by years of memories. He hesitated before answering. "Long time ago," he said quietly, "back when the world was a different place." Jim nodded to confirm. Frank served in long-range recon, Laos, 71, one of the toughest theaters any American ever saw. Gasps rippled through the diner, and several people exchanged stunned glances. A teenage boy named Ethan Marshall, tall and lean with sandy hair and a freckled face, stepped closer, his expression a mix of awe and shame. "Sir, we should have treated you better," Ethan said. "People teased you sometimes. We didn't know." Frank's eyes softened as he studied the boy's earnest face. "You owe me nothing," Frank replied, his voice steady despite its age. "I wasn't trying to be anybody." But Jim could see the way Frank's jaw tightened, the old soldier fighting vulnerability. Linda reached out a hand, squeezing Frank's shoulder. "Well, you are somebody," she said firmly. "You always were. And after tonight, this whole town knows it." Another man stepped forward. Tom Reyes, the owner of the hardware store, mid-40s with dark hair tied back and a thick winter coat. "Frank, those bikers have been bullying folks all over town. You stood up to them more than any of us did, even before we knew who you were." Frank shook his head. "I didn't stand up. I just got shoved," Jim corrected him gently. "No, Frank, you showed restraint. That's strength, too." Frank looked at Jim with gratitude, a silent exchange between two veterans who understood the weight of their pasts. Rex leaned in closer, resting his head lightly against Frank's knee. The gesture made Frank chuckle for the first time that night. The tension inside the diner slowly thawed, replaced by murmurs of respect and warmth. Someone brought Frank a plate of hot stew. Someone else adjusted the heater near the booth. People who once walked past Frank without a second glance now watched over him like family. But beneath the growing comfort, unease still lingered. Howard Briggs looked out the frosted window, arms folded. "Those bikers will be back," he warned. "Mason won't take humiliation quietly." Jim nodded, fully aware of the truth. "I know," he said, "but Frank isn't alone anymore. None of you are." A few heads nodded, though anxiety still flickered behind their eyes. Linda wiped her hands on her apron, gathering her courage. "Jim, will you stay in town a while?" she asked. Her eyes held a mixture of fear and hope. Jim considered her request. He had never planned to linger in Frostwood. He was a wanderer, a man who kept to the edges of the world. But Frostwood wasn't like other places. The people here were good. Scared, yes, but good. And Frank reminded Jim of soldiers he'd known, men who carried unbearable things alone. Jim exhaled, the decision settling over him like falling snow. "I'll stay," he said quietly, "at least until things settle." Relief washed across faces throughout the diner. Frank set down his empty mug, warmth finally returning to his cheeks. "You don't have to do that," he murmured. Jim shook his head. "I know." Frank looked down at his hands, voice barely audible. "Thank you, son." Jim didn't reply, but the silence between them was full of meaning. The storm outside roared louder, wind shaking the door as if reminding them that danger still loomed. Yet inside, between the glow of the lanterns and the murmur of grateful townspeople, warmth slowly pushed the cold back. For the first time in a long time, Frank Dalton wasn't invisible, and Frostwood wasn't defenseless. The warmth of the Timberline grill wrapped around Frank Dalton like a blanket he never knew he needed. The fire in the stone hearth crackled steadily, casting a soft amber glow across the wooden walls and illuminating the tired lines on Frank's face. His snow-soaked jacket hung on a hook near the door, replaced with a thick quilted blanket Linda Merrow had draped over his shoulders. Jim Walker sat beside him, his military cold-weather parka still zipped, steam rising faintly as the heat from the fire thawed the frost. Rex lay near Jim's boots, ears perked and eyes watchful, keeping track of every footstep in the diner. The snowstorm raged outside, but inside, a rare stillness held the room together. Word of what happened outside spread quickly through Frostwood. Families trickled into the diner, brushing off snow and stamping ice from their boots. Their faces carried a mixture of awe, guilt, and respect, emotions stirred by the sudden revelation that the soft-spoken janitor sweeping their sidewalks was once a soldier who had walked through hell for his country. Frank shifted uncomfortably under the attention, unused to being the center of anything. Jim noticed and rested a hand on Frank's forearm, his voice low. "Let them honor you," he said. "You earned that long before tonight." Frank tried to respond, but emotion caught in his throat, and he only nodded. Linda Merrow approached the table with a steaming bowl of venison stew. Her wavy dark brown hair, still damp from the snow, framed a face softened with concern. "Frank, you need to eat something," she said gently, her olive-toned skin glowing in the firelight. Frank lifted the spoon with trembling fingers, his eyes meeting hers with a gratitude deeper than words. Howard Briggs stood nearby, arms crossed over his flannel jacket, his deep-set eyes fixed on Frank with an expression bordering on reverence. Tom Reyes tidied a nearby table, but kept glancing over, as if afraid Frank might disappear if he looked away too long. The townspeople sat around quietly, letting the warmth of the room settle. When Frank finished the stew, Jim leaned back and took in the room. Rex rose, walked to Frank, and placed his head on the older man's knee. Frank rested a hand gently on the dog's neck, his rough, weathered fingers brushing the German shepherd's warm fur. Ethan Marshall, the tall, freckle-faced teenager, approached timidly, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. "Mr. Dalton," Ethan said, voice cracking with nerves, "my dad said you saved people, real people, in real battles." Frank looked up, surprised. "I was just one of many," he replied. Ethan shook his head. "Not to us." The teen's sincerity made Frank's eyes glisten. The townsfolk slowly gathered around Frank's table as though drawn by the gravity of unspoken stories. Linda leaned against the counter, wiping her hands on her apron as she listened. Howard and Tom pulled chairs closer. Cole, Hargrove, the young biker with blonde hair and conflicted eyes, stood near the doorway, his posture stiff, unsure if he belonged. He stepped forward hesitantly. "Mr. Dalton, I didn't know who you were," Cole said, voice low but earnest. Frank studied the young man carefully. Cole's face was thin and pale under the diner lights, and the regret in his eyes was unmistakable. "The patch you wore," Frank answered gently, "doesn't define you. What you do next does." Cole swallowed hard and nodded, humbled by the kindness. An idea began to take shape among the townspeople, whispers spreading from table to table about honoring Frank publicly. Linda Merrow cleared her throat. "Everyone in Frostwood should know who Frank truly is," she said, "and what he did for this country." Howard Briggs nodded seriously. "We let Mason Briggs treat this town like cowards, but Frank showed us we don't have to be afraid anymore." Ethan tugged on his mother's sleeve, wide-eyed. "We should put something outside," he suggested. "Something that says we stand together." Jim listened quietly, watching the ripple of unity grow stronger in the faces around him. Tom Reyes finally stepped forward, a determined glint in his dark eyes. "I can craft a sign," he said. "A real one, weatherproof, big enough for everyone to see." The townspeople murmured in approval. Frank shook his head slowly. "I don't want to fuss," he said, voice almost pleading. "I'm no hero." Jim leaned in, his voice firm but gentle. "You gave everything and asked for nothing. That's what makes you a hero." Frank's gaze dropped to his hands, aged by time and sacrifice. After a long moment, he whispered, "If it helps this town stand tall, then okay." By dawn the next morning, after the storm eased, Tom Reyes and Howard Briggs braved the freezing air to mount the new wooden plaque at the entrance of the diner. The letters were carved deep and bold, painted in black against the polished oak. When Linda pulled open the shades, sunlight struck the sign, and the entire diner gathered outside in the snow to read it together. Jim stood behind Frank, one hand on the old man's shoulder, Rex positioned loyally beside him. The plaque read, "This diner protects its own, especially those who once protected us." The words cut through the cold like warmth itself. Frank stared at the sign for a long time. The snow crunched softly underfoot as people waited for his reaction. His pale blue eyes shimmered as if reflecting decades of buried memories. Brothers lost, battles survived, and the quiet decades that followed. Linda slipped her arm around his, her expression full of tenderness. Howard clapped him on the back. Ethan smiled up at him. Cole Hargrove stood near the edge of the crowd, head bowed respectfully. Frank inhaled the biting Alaska air and let it out slowly. "Thank you," he said. "I thought the world forgot us." Jim answered, "Not this town, not anymore." As the morning light brightened, warmth spread through Frostwood in a way no fire could replicate. The sign became more than wood and paint. it became a promise. A reminder that dignity mattered, that courage could come from the quietest places, and that justice, once restored, could reignite a community's spirit. Jim Walker rested a hand on Rex's head, watching the old soldier finally receive the honor he deserved. In the heart of the frozen Alaska morning, among people who had rediscovered their unity, Frank Dalton stood taller than he had in years. For the first time since Laos, he felt truly seen. In the freezing silence of Alaska, where life can harden even the kindest hearts, God still sends us small miracles disguised as ordinary moments. Sometimes those miracles look like an aging janitor quietly sweeping snow, carrying a past no one bothered to ask about. Sometimes they look like a weary veteran who chooses to stand up for what's right, even when he could have walked away. And sometimes, a whole community rediscovers its courage because God whispered strength into the few who dared to act. Frank Dalton wasn't granted eternal youth, but God preserved the strength of his spirit. Jim Walker isn't an angel, but God placed him in the right place at the right time, so justice could be restored to someone who deserved it. And maybe that's the miracle we often overlook. God doesn't always part the skies or shake the earth. More often, he sends his miracles in the form of ordinary people walking beside us every day. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, comment, and share it with someone who might need hope today. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire faith, courage, and kindness. May God bless you, protect you, and bring peace to everyone watching this story. Amen.